Hello, this presentation is brought to you by
Garima, Mary,
Joseph,
Ethan, and Jordan.
Without further ado, I present to you Cylinder of Doom. Objectives. In this lab, we had two main objectives. Our first objective was to use pressure measurements at varying Reynolds numbers to determine the coefficient of drag due to pressure on the cylinder surface. Our second objective was to make a flow visualization video, which would demonstrate cylindrical vortex shedding as smoke moves around the cylinder. Introduction. Some points to note before getting started are as follows. First to note, for flow around the cylinder, drag is considered mainly pressure drag at moderate to high Reynolds numbers. At these Reynolds numbers, the boundary layer is no longer on the cylinder, and pressure around the cylinder is not symmetric. Last to note that in increasing Reynolds numbers, this experiment should demonstrate how the pressure drag is reduced by generating turbulence on the boundary layer.
In order to start the experiment, we did a safety check in order to secure the wind tunnel by ensuring the doors were securely closed and everyone was ready for the test. For collecting the pressure data for each flow regime, we used the ScanEvalve pressure measurement system and used MATLAB in order to process the data we collected. In order to capture the flow due to the smoke over the surface of the cylinder, we set a fan speed of 200 revolutions per minute. Also, we collected pressure data at each of the ports on the cylinder at different fan speeds that covered a range of low and high Reynolds. For our experiment, we referred to the potential flow equation, which explains the relationship between the coefficient of pressure over the surface of the cylinder and the position of the port on the surface of the cylinder. The equation comes from the assumption that the pressure is symmetric over the stagnation point that is on the front of the cylinder. Also, it is assumed that the drag on the cylinder under inviscid flow is zero. On the other hand, there was drag due to pressure acting on the surface of the cylinder for our experiment, and so there were certainly deviations in our data from this particular equation.
Here we have the graph of coefficient of pressure versus the angle of the port that it was taken at. The dotted line shows the ideal solution of the potential flow equation, and the dashed lines show our various test samples as indicated by the legend. Obviously, as we didn't have inviscid flow, as has been mentioned, the plots do not match that ideal. We see at the front the zero position facing the free stream flow. They all match pretty well with the coefficient of pressure of 1. And then as it gets towards the back of the cylinder, positively and negatively, the flows begin to diverge, with the higher RPM having higher coefficients of pressure and the lower having somewhat lower. Here we have the standard deviation of the coefficient of pressure. Each port actually measured 100 data points per run, so this shows the standard deviation in coefficient of pressure calculations. As you can see, again, at facing the stream, it's very low, but as it goes around the cylinder, it starts to deviate further, and especially with the lower RPMs, as you get some variance with adhesion to the cylinder versus separation from the cylinder. The 400 RPM is noticeably larger. We don't have a solid answer for why that is. There may have been some disruption to the equipment in that test. It's also possible that that's in a transition period from lower to higher Reynolds numbers, so there's further deviation as some tests are more laminar and some tests are more turbulent. Now here we have the coefficient of drag plotted against the Reynolds number. As you can see, it forms a roughly linear decreasing relation. As the Reynolds number increases, the coefficient of drag decreases, which is what we expected with the pressure dropping off, or or pressure-reduced drag dropping off as the Reynolds number increased.
So for the results section, we found that there was some inconsistencies in our plot symmetry, and this can be attributed to many systematic errors such as imperfect spacing between the pressure ports. And it's also noted that in a real-world scenario, there are many variables at play that will affect the plot symmetry as well. And also, it's expected that for a cylinder, it would not introduce any additional downward or lift force. But as you can see in our flow visualization, we find that there is a momentary net lift force and down force generated. We also found that the flow was not two-dimensional in the middle of the cylinder, but was actually three-dimensional, and this can be seen in the flow visualization video, as we can see the vortex shedding to have an additional axis of dimensions since it sways. Also, we found that given in the lab manual that the roughness of the surface increases the Reynolds number, and as a result, the introduction of more turbulent forces adds additional energy, causing the flow to be more attached. And there is a limit to this because as the Reynolds number increases too much, it will start having adverse effects on the flow separation. And we also can see that in figure 2, as Reynolds increases, the drag force decreases. And some of these examples can be seen in natural and human designs. Palm trees and silos, for example, add roughness to the texture to increase the Reynolds number, which in turn decreases their drag.
Strouhal number is the dimensionless frequency of the vortex shedding as a function of the Reynolds number. In this experiment, the vortex shedding occurs due to the flow separation around the surface of the cylinder. The vortex shedding behind the cylinder leads to periodic pressure oscillations in the transverse and flow directions. The oscillation frequency in the transverse direction matches the vortex shedding frequency, which we determined from our flow visualization video. We use the observed oscillation frequency, the diameter of the cylinder, and the freestream velocity to calculate a Strouhal number of 0.12683 for a Reynolds number of magnitude 4. In this experiment, we calculated the coefficients of drag, pressure, and the Strouhal number based on measurements taken at different flow regimes for different Reynolds numbers. For the coefficient of pressure, slight deviations from symmetry illustrate how the flow was not entirely inviscid, which is why our data didn't completely match the theoretical potential flow equation. We were also able to determine the coefficient of drag due to pressure was decreasing as the Reynolds number increased. For the Strouhal number, our value was in the range of 0.1 to 0.2, which demonstrates a laminar flow with distinctly shaped vortices behind the cylinder. In conclusion, the majority of our analysis showed that our data supports our initial objectives both qualitatively and quantitatively.